Next up, we've got Ted Pallas from Satore Studio. Hey, Ted.
Hi, everybody.
So tell us a little background on yourself and on Savages.
Yeah, I am sitting here in our studio in Edgewater, New Jersey, and we are a small team that does team extension for real-time projects, specifically using Notch and Unreal Engine generally inside of a disguised media server. So we've done this over the past year with Satore Studio, Integrated Visions. We've done some work with Worldstage, on commercials, live events, concerts. Like, it really runs a gamut. And then now that we're in quarantine, also broadcast, all of it. Yeah, frames everywhere.
So tell us a little bit about the presentation you're going to
do. Today's presentation is going to be on Houdini digital assets and how, I mentioned before that Savages does a lot of work with a pretty wide range of studios and a pretty wide range of deployments. And, if I was to do what a more traditional technical artist would do and own like a very specific job, it would be really hard for me to work in all of these contexts because I'd be needing to use a different set of tools. But instead, I really frame myself as a Houdini artist, right? So today's presentation is about how HDAs can lead to strategies for both like individuals on a team and actually whole teams to help push the production down the field with a minimal amount of pain and headache during revision.
Right on.
Yeah.
That was awesome. Let's jump in.
Great. Hey Houdini fam, my name is Ted, and today we are going to talk about virtual production strategies for Houdini artists. Virtual production is the art of combining real-time visualization technology, like for example the Unreal Engine or Notch or Touchdesigner, with workflows and expectations like you might find in a more traditional VFX workflow, right? So, what does that mean? That means that, virtual production is about using technologies that may or may not initially be designed and engineered for production work to do production work fast. The idea is we can look at it, ideally outside of a quarantine context while we're all together on site. But in the meantime, like while we're still in a quarantine context, virtual production has been keeping a whole community of VFX artists, working together to get work out, and it's real easy to imagine a lot of the techniques that are being explored right now are just going to end up as being part of the toolkit. So from a TD perspective, you can think of virtual production as a lot like, making a kind of a traditional really fancy video game, right? But instead of a player, you have a camera and you're recording the output of that camera. And usually that camera is bolted to a real camera, but we're going to get into that in a minute. So I guess I'll come and say hello. What up? Let's talk a little bit about the alphabet soup around all this stuff. So virtual production, we just talked about it, moving the VFX process to the suit as much as possible using real-time technology. It's a hugely wide term, and I don't want to say it means nothing, but it means so many things that it's hard to imagine it meaning very much at all. And then we've also got, here, let's get back to my controller. There we go. XR. This is where I mostly live. XR is typically used to define shoots where an actor is kind of literally standing on a display environment, right? And they've got a tracked camera that is perspective mapped this display environment to match the content that we're rendering through the render engine, right? So, you can imagine if we're looking at like an LED cube surface, we're going to look at some in a moment, but if we're going to look at an LED cube surface, we're like perspective mapping from the camera the effect shot that we want onto that LED display and then shooting it through like a real camera. Mixed reality is a lot like extended reality, but specifically it's got a front plate and a back plate. So now we're going to look at some proper, here we go, one more, click it. A little bit of jazz. I'm going to hit pause right here. So we can see, there we go. this little guy right here I want to talk about real quick while we've got him on the screen. Take us through a little sidebar. Is a Blacktrax beacon. So the cool thing about virtual production and extended reality is, you know, we're out of a Houdini viewport. We're in a render engine, and there's also talent in the render engine with us, and they're holding this stuff. So here we've got our friend Michelle over at Integrated Visions and Choreograph. She's their creative director. We've been doing some work with them on some pipeline build out, and you know, we just real quick extruded this text, I believe, inside of Houdini actually, and just told it to take its transform from a rigid body that we made out of these two. So it's kind of a tacky rigid body, and its orientation is the orientation that we give it when it's pointing towards the camera. But we're, you know, making this rigid body. There we go. When they get close enough together, it disappears because we only see one beacon. But yeah, we're making this rigid body from these Blacktrax, right? And these Blacktrax are little IR beacons that are pointing up at the ceiling, and there's cameras on the ceiling, and 3 cameras see the IR beacon, and we can see all of it. I just want to back up a little bit more, and one more time, we're going to look at how the camera's moving, and the background is staying in like a nice perspective to the camera. We don't feel like it's herky-jerky moving around the same way it might if it was like actually projected onto the LED. Instead, it's mated to the movement of the camera. So that's kind of the whole shebang right there. And I didn't mean to hit escape. I'm gonna hit from current slide. I'm just gonna go ahead, display settings, swap presenter, boom, keep on moving. Augmented reality is if we take what we just saw and we chopped off the backplate and we just had the Choreograph logo, that would be augmented reality. Typically, you know, there's no backplate there, and also usually like where we are on the set is not quite as important to where the talent is that's relevant to the AR effect. And then lastly, virtual reality. And I'm only mentioning this here because it often comes up in the same conversation as particularly augmented reality or mixed reality from like a previs perspective, right? So virtual production has a couple different roles, and it's not just about like the final experience or that final deliverable, right? But it's also about, sorry, I got some hiccups. There we go. But it's also about like previs and being able to see your effect well before, you know, you're actually about to go shoot with it. You could even go as far as doing some of the work that Matt Workman's been doing, and like putting digital characters out on your digital set that you're going to go shoot on with maybe real characters in like an XR context, you know. So a single project can easily transition, you know, from virtual production to extended reality, and then maybe have like a related virtual reality experience, you know, because all of these alphabet soups work together to essentially make the work that we do in Houdini into almost a kind of like pasta. You know, it's all mesh. It's all going to get render sauce put on it. So, all right, all that said, let's talk a bit about the components of an XR shoot, because they're a little bit different from a traditional film set. And I think that having an awareness of these differences is definitely going to be helpful. So first things first is the display, which is just front and center on an XR set for sure. The display is, you know, usually an immersive surface of a sort that the talent is literally like standing on, right? So, you know, the work that you do is really like pivotal to everybody's experience of how the day is going to go. Next, we've also got the camera with tracking. So before I mentioned, when we were looking at Michelle holding up the logo, I mentioned that the camera with tracking was, you know, able to project onto the cube the view of what we were just looking at. That's what we were just looking at on this previous slide with the cube here, right? This is actually just like a camera projection. This should be no problem to imagine. So, you know, generally we're working with Stipe, and the way that Stipe works is it can look either up at the ceiling or down at the floor or back at a wall. What's important is that the surface is planar in a single axis, and this surface is covered in IR dots. And there's a camera on the camera that's looking directly at these IR dots. And because of these IR dots, just irregular placement, like you just put them out, right? Because of this, the camera is able to know where it is in space, and it can see where it is in space, and it can pass that on, right? And it can pass that data onto the media server. And the media server traditionally, right, we're working with Disguise. Traditionally, a Disguise server would mostly be concerned with like outputting media, right? So pixels like video or maybe like a notch file. But in this context, it's not just outputting media, but it's also both outputting and inputting camera tracking data. So it's taking camera tracking data in from the Stipe camera tracking system. There's many others, but Stipe is the one that we've got the most experience with for sure. And then it is passing that transform data off to the render engine, which in our case is usually either the Unreal Engine or Notch. And this is Notch. I'm going to fire to my other OBS scene so you can see the whole node graph, because that's really what I want to show you here. I guess we can look at this animation real quick. It's not much to look at outside of its XR context, like without the person there. But you can get a sense, Notch is capable of doing some depth of field and, PBR workflow, and it's got lighting, and these are actually fairly complex area light shadows and this, that, and the other thing. However, these are dynamic, so they do not have the same shadows. And now we're going to back up to the top because I'm not really so interested in looking at this scene, but instead I thought this was a good one to show you what a fairly typical XR node graph might end up looking like from a structural standpoint. So when you bring geometry into Notch from Houdini, in general, you're going to be bringing finished files. So this one came in as an FBX because there's a version of this set where we transit it with textures from Houdini. FBX is great for that. And when you bring in one of these nodes, what you're looking at is this container, and you've got these materials on the bottom, and I can expand the node. And when I expand the node, I see what I would have been looking at in Houdini as object level labels. So that's mostly what I wanted to show you in here is, that you get a similar set of labels that you would get in other render engines, right? It's just they're presented in a way that's a little bit funky. And I would say that that's a good way to think about Notch in general, is a lot like other render engines, just a little bit funky. And I think where it's special is in what it lets us do with particles especially. So, in real time while I'm recording here on this particular build, I'm only getting 20 frames, but on a regular XR machine, this hits 60, no problem. And these are fully specular. They can take a dynamic HDRI. I don't have any inputs to give it one right now, but Notches in general are go-to preferred render engine of choice. Sorry, just kind of swallowing. I need a little bit of water there, but Notch is where we like to work because it lets us be as expressive in real time as we're able to be in a viewport in Houdini with I wouldn't say a similar set of nodes at all, but at the end of the day, what is a relatively approachable and kind of easy to parse pile of tools here. So talking about Notch, specifically Notch is going to be hosted on the media server on the same CPU, right? That's running the main media server thread. So the media server has to take the camera tracking data and then in time pass it to the render engine and then grab the frame output and possibly even like composite it. If we're doing some front plate, back plate, mixed reality work, we've got to take that that frame that you saw of Michelle came right out of the disguise server, right? So we've got to take that frame and then put it all together. And the media server itself is actually doing all of this in real time. The disguise server is our server of choice because it's able to actually pass us a final composited frame, right? So the director can be looking at the shot essentially with no delay, just like a frame, the frame that it takes to put it all together. It's wild. And then, lastly, there's an art team on set too, right? Because the thing about real time is we could see it happen very, very fast. And because we could see it happen very, very fast, we also can see the result of changes very, very fast. So we're finding that more often there's budget present for, having people around when the work is most important. Half of the changes that get asked for realistically are like tiny. So handling them before people leave the shoot is not really a problem. And let's move on to our next slide. And here's some composited XR. What I want to draw attention to here is, let's make sure it's not behind my head. Yeah, it's definitely not. You can see right here is the LED wall edge, right? You can see as the camera pans back on, wait a moment for the watermark. As the camera pans back on, we can see in the blue, the edge of the LED wall. This is that same cube that we were looking at before, right? And what we're looking at here is a set extension that's actually also being put together and composited by the disguise media server, right? So this is a good view of the several literal worlds, right, that extended reality is actually stitching together. So we've got, starting from the camera, we've got the Stipes transform, right, which is getting understood by the media server to live in a general transform space, right? And then that general transform space is getting passed off in this instance to the Unreal Engine. And then the Unreal Engine's transform space has to match, if we were doing a black tracks effect, has to match the black tracks transform space as well, right? So there's 4 spaces that are, maintaining a stable connection. It's really rather exciting as a digital artist to be able to, work in this way. And what we're also getting to see here is just a couple of our HDAs. So these trees are all being sorted by an HDA we made called X-axis sorter, which does what it says on the box. And the background back here is an HDA we made that will look for the height and width of an image and then make a plane that big and curve it, right? So I'm bringing this up because we use HDAs to. Okay, all right, Alex. Hi, bye. It's great. Can watch that one all day. So I'm bringing this up because we use HDAs to work responsively on set. Speaking to that last point of the components of an XR shoot, I'm going to get into more detail on this in a moment. But as Houdini artists, right? I think we're especially well positioned to hear the note and know where in the note graph the note lives, so we can start to address it. And I think it's a little bit faster to getting to that point than my experience of other packages for sure. So who's doing this stuff? Who's calling? VP, virtual production, is all about a studio focus, right? So it's a lot of green screen shoots, and that means it's what you would expect. It's film and TV, it's corporate video, and it's a lot of advertising. XR, which, as I mentioned, is a lot more of our work, is interesting because it's got a lot of live focus, right? So I would say pretty much 100% of our XR colleagues, as far as I'm aware, have a live events career that they're, in most cases, still up to, right? A lot of media server programmers and some lighting designers and some scenic designers, but there aren't too many pure XR visual effects. All I do is 3D people for XR, right? So what's interesting there, and I'm bringing this up, is phrasing it delicately. I'm on like my ninth take because I failed to phrase this delicately. With these live events teams, right? They don't traditionally work with visual effects people, so they're not used to a visual effects team. They're not used to the idea that like 2 or 3 artists might work across all of the departments that are present on a show or shoot that's maybe like not so big or expansive. Because for most live event designers, if you're a set designer, you design sets, and if you're a lighting designer, you design lights, and if you're a costume designer, you design costumes. And on a certain level, the work relies on designers being able to share experiences on a stage, right? And with visual effects, you know, it's not quite as direct. It's like I've got lights shining on me, and it's a little bit later than it was when I started, so now the lights are a little bit brighter, but I don't really have the control to dim them out, so like I'm just kind of dealing with it. Whereas if I was lighting myself inside of a render engine, I would have nothing but control. I'd be able to go into my skin and actually like turn down the lights from within my body if I wanted to like think about it like that, right? And I think that way of working is something that we found to really like blow people's minds in the live event community, especially over the last year, just because there's been just a different focus across the entire event history. Yeah, I don't know. There's like just kind of no way to delicately put it. It's just a very traditional community in its own way, but it's about to really need all of your support, you know, all of your hard work. So let's talk a little bit about what we want to keep in mind specifically, right, when we're making content for virtual production, and more specifically maybe extended reality, like cases where we're going to be having like real people and maybe real stuff next to fake stuff and fake people, right? So the first consideration is scale. And what's the world unit of an integer? Does one look like 1 centimeter, which is the Unreal Engine, or is it 1 meter, which is like Notch and Touchdesigner and most of the media servers themselves? Everybody needs to be on a page about this, because if they're not, it can be a real nightmare when it comes to managing asset import and who's it coming from. And, you know, depending on your workflow, you might not be looking at everything in like quite the same context, and it could be easy to let something slip until it's a pain in the butt to fix it. So just get everybody on a page when you're starting. And then at the same time that you're getting on a page about scale, if you can do it, you want to know not only the origin of your scene, but also the origin of your scene in relation to where the camera is going to be, right? Because all of these media servers, and especially if you're adding, you know, black tracks, they have a very absolute idea of where a spot in the world is. So the direction that your camera is looking is going to be exposed to a certain like chunk of that transform space, right? And you're not going to have anything to do with what that is. That's going to be set by the calibration of the space, and maybe they'll ask you for some input. But more typically, I think you're going to be walking into a studio that's already ready to shoot. So having these numbers in mind can help you like put things where they want to go, so that you don't have to do a lot of like adjustment in Unreal Engine or Notch to get your work to actually just be visible to the camera, which can be super frustrating. Also, another thing that could be super frustrating is forgetting to think about how bright your content is going to be on the display. So you'll remember when Alex was walking back and forth across that super bright white floor, the space above the floor was also pretty bright, but it was all mostly toned towards blue, right? And I made that choice because I wanted it to feel, no matter what, like the light was coming from the ground, right? Something to keep in mind, especially when you're working with LED, is that an LED is actually a little tiny light, and that little tiny light is shining like right into the camera. And it's not just one of it, but it's like a whole bunch of lights, right? And it's not just shining right into the camera, but there's like 3 planes, and they're shining in different ways into the camera. And it can be a lot for, you know, it can be a lot for somebody to balance later on. And you can do a lot to help the work look better by making sure that you're not, you know, casting unnecessary light on the actor by relying on brightness to call out detail. You want to call out detail with, broader strokes if possible, because again, the LED density, while it's definitely dense, is not the 4K surface that you might be more used to working on. And then we also want to be thinking about the overhead of our effect in the render engine, right? Which we can often shorthand as how many particles can I render on top of my draw calls. A key strategy for minimizing this in all of the real-time engines is to combine textures as much as you're able to. And then lastly, the repeatability of the interactions. So we'll remember Michelle bouncing back and forth with that logo, right? That's an easy thing to do over and over and over. So that's a pretty successful effect. Where something that I've found, especially when working with black tracks, is it can be hard. Imagine we've got like a hole in space and I have to like punch the hole in space, right? And then like smoke's gonna come out around my hand. It's totally cool. Stuff like that is totally awesome. But it definitely takes a certain amount of rehearsal and practice to like dial that kind of a thing in. So maybe instead of having the effect happen when I pass through space, I'm gonna actually just like watch the actor do it from off camera, and I'm gonna throw a knob. I'm gonna throw a fader when it's time. So he goes in the smoke and I time it with a fader, and then everything works out a little bit smoother. Similarly, if we can bake it, right? I'll bake it instead of relying on it being totally dynamic. Let's talk about how Houdini can help us work faster. I've been saying notes, like a broken record all throughout this thing. Why? Notes are real. Notes are part of it, especially with extended reality and virtual production. If we're working in real time, everybody who can afford to pay for this stuff, because real time is not an inexpensive practice, everybody who can afford to pay for this stuff is aware, they're savvy, and they're aware that at the same way that they can like see the effect in real time during the shoot, they can also see the result of notes in real time. And if they don't think that the note was very complicated, they'll expect it to happen quick, right? That's just part of it. So Houdini has, I think, baked into its very way of letting us approach 3D, like a lot of strategies baked in to working fast. And one of the core ones that has been up on the screen for a moment now is Houdini lets us parameterize ourselves. So generally with a giant node graph, we don't need to get to all of it. We just need to configure most of it, right? But the parts that we need to get to are going to have a very profound effect. So we can take those handful of controls relative to the amount of controls that are on all of the nodes, right? And we can put them somewhere that they're easier to get to, whether that's a subnet or an HDA or a control null. Second point is if you're working in a group, you can rely on like $job or $hip to make it so that your files move just very elegantly from one system to the other. And I don't think I've ever experienced this in any other DCC be quite so painless. I did a whole giant project with Matt Barker last fall that really ended up, I think, sprawling as in terms of data beyond where either of us saw it going. But it wasn't really all that stressful because $job is a very reliable way to be managing data. Third is to never, have to delete your history, and you can proceduralize everything, right? So what this means is you can see just like I mentioned before, a small amount of handles can have a profound effect. If you keep a good awareness of how your node graph is put together, you can strategically approach a stack of notes maybe so that like turning one knob is hitting 2.5 of your 10 changes that you have to make, or contributing to, a certain number of them. And then, additionally, and maybe in support of that, you've also got like access to all of these really smart people and all of the HDAs that they make. So in addition to what you might find on the OD Force forums or on Orbital, I also want to call out just a handful of libraries that we use all the time over here. We use MOPS. Toadstrom gave a great presentation the other day. Also, in addition to that, we've got the Animatrix, AELib, and QLib TD Tools libraries, all of which in different ways make it, almost painless to approach the vast majority of data and modeling operations that we cover on a day-to-day basis, including things that it's, to be frank, just as easy to do with the SOPs, but instead of having to wire up, my own, maybe relatively, I don't want to say inefficient chains, but I come at this as a designer first, not a programmer. These are people that have gone ahead and made some really just slamming ways to manipulate data and mesh. And then lastly, I want to also mention Lynx, who has done that same work specifically for forces inside of DOPS. And I don't think that one gets mentioned quite often enough. But if you've been looking at, wanting to get more into the world of DOPS and just scratching your head about how you might want to make the looks in your head come out in your viewport, Lynx is definitely worth a look. And then, lastly, if you're working inside of Unreal Engine especially, or, Unity or another engine that can take an HDA is a super simple, very flexible way to just transit geometry. And often I'll find that as I'm bringing geometry back and forth, even if I'm not exposing parameters initially, it might only be 2 or 3 trips before I get a sense of what I'm wanting to adjust as I'm looking at, maybe a table in a scene for the first time, or, something like that, right? So this is, again, getting back to that idea that virtual production is more than just the shoot, but it's also previs. Similarly, using Houdini to work fast, right? That can happen across almost the entire process. A little bit about preparing the geometry for real-time production. So poly counts, it's not quite as aggressive as it is with games, just to be entirely frank. A mid-importance model will typically have around 125,000 to 150,000 polygons without really worrying about it, and sometimes even more than that. Unreal Engine and Notch can both reliably draw up to 12 million pixels, polys rather. But that said, optimization still matters. So internal faces and overlapping light map UVs, can both contribute to things looking weird, even if they're not running worse, right? The internal faces can cause sometimes some funny flashing at edges, and overlapping light maps, everybody's seen it. And then additionally, calling too many textures. So if you have a model that, this is especially if you're working with substances or Quixel, it can be real easy to call 5 or 6 materials on a single model. You should try not to do that, because you're actually calling that model once for every material, right? So this is where you want to start thinking about Substance Painter, especially if you're working with combined materials. As far as getting the geometry out, if it's animated, Alembic works everywhere that we work. FBX does too, and we'll use FBX, but we find that more often than not, when something is animating, it's also going to deform at some point. And if it's not going to deform at some point, we're probably going to animate it native to the render engine. So an FBX is just not really too much part of what we get up to from an animation perspective. Something to keep in mind, though, if you're getting into transiting, is that not all of the render engines will refresh UVs quite the same way as a more rigorous renderer like a Mantra will. So, you might see things popping and flashing that you're not used to seeing, and just, keep that all in mind. You're going to want to put some time here for sure. And something that will help you is deleting all of your attributes. So an Alembic will let you bring point attributes, right? But the real-time engine generally can't do anything with them. It's just going to have to look at them and go, I can't do anything with them every single frame, right? So in addition to overhead, this also will cut down on the actual size of the Alembic, which can be helpful too. And then lastly, exporting through ROPs. ROPs are great. They're render presets. And if you're newer to Houdini, you might not think about ROPs too much, but really you might want to make one ROP for everything that you preset, because that lets you keep the same render output name. We haven't found that there's a ton of value in naming our content over in the render engine for a particular version. Sometimes there is, and it's easy to spot, but usually like we just care about what it is. And we care about that it's the right one for the scene that we're working in, right? So we don't usually do scene work out of our library. We'll copy the library asset to a project directory, and then from there, it's easy to, you know, bring it into Houdini and iterate on it and just keep on printing table, 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 instead of ending up with a stack of like table 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 68, whatever. I think my favorite feature of Houdini, of all 16 million features of Houdini, is the Houdini digital asset world, right? So the Houdini digital asset, I've got a much deeper tutorial on these on the side effects tutorials section. But just kind of a quick, super high level overview. An HDA lets you scoop up some Houdini into a little box and then open that box in our case, Unreal Engine, but you can also get to them in Unity or Cinema 4D or 3D Studio Max or also Maya. And that's really great because I think a lot of artists find Houdini kind of scary, but also alluring, right? So as Houdini artists, we're able to, you know, open up the power of the tool to our collaborators, right? But like also help make it into an approachable bite of work, right? And one of the core tricks to succeeding here is keeping the HDA that we're working on scoped, right? So ideally, when we're looking at the list of HDAs, like we have an HDA that does one thing, right? And we know very clearly what that thing is, right? And so the scope can be very narrow, like we can be breaking some edges, or it can be wide. It can deliver an entire set, but the idea is that the scope is unified, right? So that what comes out of it is all together in a way that makes a lot of sense. And in support of that, once the asset is in play, you want to make sure that there's not so many parameters out that the artist is, you know, kind of overwhelmed and confused, because it can be a lot of configuring and baking, especially if they're not working in Houdini. And then, you know, if they're not used to turning on and off their engine, there's just a lot of like quality of life. And then also, in addition to exposing only what's needed, it's helpful to expose the parameters in the order that it's best for them to be touched. And, you know, I think that that's a pretty self-explanatory UI, UX kind of a rule. But, you know, taking that one step further is you can really hammer this home by like even making folders and groups, right? Like it's worth taking the time if you're going to be collaborating, especially to explore the tools that Houdini gives us to do that as painlessly as we possibly can. You know, to that point, it's worth it to develop a style for how you start to present your work to other artists, because, you know, this UX is going to be ultimately part of what contributes to the speed and, you know, ease with which the team is able to work, right? That's the unique position of the Houdini artists is, you know, we're not just artists, but I think in many cases we're also like TDs and, you know, able to provide some of that technical leadership very directly through an HDA. But, you know, at the same time, it's on us to make that process approachable. And then also, you know, keep in mind that an HDA can form a chain, right? So you don't have to expose a ton of parameters. You know, for example, we've got a whole quick land workflow that we show in that tutorial that I mentioned before, which you can find on the website here on side effects, where we go from one terrain loading HDA to a masking HDA to a scatter HDA, right? And it's all in the same family, and it all only takes a couple minutes to step through, but chunking out those different parts of the process lets us engage only the parts that we need to, right? Because we've definitely like received some maps where we've thrown quick land at a mask that somebody else already had brought into the engine, for example, and we didn't need to go around and like break it away from a terrain loader that was already baked in. So yeah. And then lastly, very specifically, not just exocide or rhizome, but more generally, we can use HDAs to like extend our pipeline to places that it might be a little bit tricky to reach otherwise, right? So, exocide and rhizome are the two that we use most frequently, but just built into Houdini, there's also, I believe, Gaia and ZBrush and, some other tools as well. So, Houdini really, when it comes to working well with others, is really a great tool to just, I think, approach from a collaboration standpoint, in addition to sort of the more traditional, like, procedural geometry mindset. And just before we wrap, we're just about at time. I thought it would be fun to look at a couple of our favorite side effects labs nodes. So these are ones that come up, all the time as we're doing general modeling operations. Just go look at them. So we've got, first up, the game res. I think everybody at this point is pretty familiar with the 3D Scans Dragon. It's got almost 2.4 million polygons in it. And game res, the only controls I hit here were the number to keep. This is how many polygons I wanted it to keep. And the bake resolution for the ambient occlusion map, which I set to 2K and 50,000 polygons. And in just a moment on this computer, which is not all that much computer, it's an i7 and a 1080. On this computer, it took about 30 seconds to crunch out, and I got this beautifully decimated dragon. We also fairly frequently will use edge color, which does a very simple, very fast to calculate convex and concave calculation, and lets you art direct some color. And then on top of that, we'll often chuck a quick material so we can get a sense of what light reflection is going to do with the mesh. And then we can move on over here to our sphere generator. This is one I find myself reaching to maybe even daily, dare I say it. It makes a really great sphere for doing these kind of like classic displacement operations. So this is another labs node. This is the triplanar displace. I think this one's relatively new. Triplanar displace will work with this mesh, whether it has UVs or not, because it's triplanar, and you can give it a displacement texture such as the kind that you might find with a standard Quixel, right? And it works really great. This is just a cliff texture thrown right at the mesh, and then let's just turn it into something very Houdini like that. And I made this in just a moment by grabbing a curvature, which gives us these great concave and convex attributes, and then poly reducing with convexity as my weight, and then taking that poly reduction and deleting a chunk of it and poly wiring it, because that's what I tend to do to stuff. And then one more set of nodes I want to show off over here are these spiral, which when I first started using Houdini, I believe it was version 14.5 or 15, maybe 15 actually. I think I was like playing with 14 somewhere, I was aware of it, but maybe 15 with Apprentice. So yeah, Houdini didn't have a spiral, but now it has a spiral. And there's also a really great lab sweep tool that will come with its own profile, or if you want to, you can plug in your own profile, and it just gets really consistently easy to work with results. I think one of the points of Houdini that might frustrate some people that come to it from other packages, particularly Cinema 4D, is some of these operations might feel a little bit more out of reach than they're used to, but the labs toolkit, just to show off how giant this geo section is here, there really is quite a bit. And I think if you're new to Houdini, it's definitely worth, taking the time for sure to see what is in the labs tools in particular. And just to squeeze in a little bit more, let's take a look at this Unreal Engine project, which contains a couple of our assets and also a real, blueprint setup for shooting XR. So this cube here is a template cube that is in all of the projects that we do with Worldstage because it represents the actual size of the cube that we will be shooting on there, right? So if I go into play, there we go. And if I hit the spacebar, the cube goes away. We also have to do that during a shoot on the machine that's running Unreal. And then the camera that I'm in would actually be the stipe. So, you know, this is very literally what you would be doing with the computer doing the shoot during XR. It's playing the scene out of the editor, and then the camera grabs the camera and moves, and somebody stands on the display that's rendering out the image that's currently rendering to my screen, and then that person is composited in. And in a nutshell, that's pretty much it. What's great, though, about being in an engine like the Houdini engine here, I'll just knock this out of the way. The Houdini engine and working with Unreal is we can change things over here in the render engine without having to actually go all the way back to Houdini. So this was made, this is part of the upcoming MOPS release. It lets us make a font oblique without even having to have an oblique, which is super handy. Graphic design is, I would say, the trickiest part of working in extended reality, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of that stuff here, but you know, trying to keep this to 30 minutes is tricky. So, and I think with this little taste of an HDA in the Unreal Engine, this is a good place to wrap this initial sort of chat. What I wanted to cover, I think we got through it, was a kind of a broad overview of where Houdini fits into this newly popular virtual production thing. And you know, it's exactly the places that you might expect, right? Because Houdini's been shining at real time for a minute. But what's different about it and what's a little bit tricky about it is where the work is landing, right? Because where traditionally the Houdini artist has been part of a team of people who understand the Houdini artist, with extended reality especially, everything is getting figured out almost from scratch. You know, so I hope that this chat helps you, you know, feel like you have an approach that you might be able to set up for yourself as a creative, because there's only going to be more and more opportunity in the extended reality space. And yeah, definitely, you know, I don't think there is enough people in the space that actually make the XR, right? So, you know, I would encourage you to, wherever you're at right now during quarantine especially, you know, see who's looking to be virtualizing their productions in your area and see what they need, because they probably need a Houdini artist, right? And they just don't know that they have to ask for one, because traditionally they're asking for like a lighting designer or somebody to do their set. So yeah, I think with that, I am going to sign off and edit this all together. Bye.